Claire, of course, I don't know if I can see the images.
Yes, we'll be able to bring them up so you can see them.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Apologies for the delay in starting this art talk, but welcome. This art talk with the Imperial War Museum, a prestigious range of speakers this afternoon. The topic under discussion is about the exhibition Architecture of War. This brings together artworks from across the Imperial War Museum's collection. And the talk focuses on the themes of construction, examining images of workplaces, fortifications, and machineries built for war. I'll briefly introduce who's going to speak today. I'm James Davis. I'm from the Cultural Institute in London. We have the exhibition's curator, Claire Brenard, who will talk to artist Deanna Petherbridge. We also have with us Chris Penser, founder and director of Love Art London, and Thomas Marks, editor of Apollo magazine. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, before I talk about Architecture of War, I wanted to just briefly introduce the art collection here at IWM. The museum was founded in 1917 as a memorial to the Great War, and the art collection has been going from about the same time. In fact, the first sort of official war art schemes were started in 1916 during the First World War, and at that time there were many different government-run schemes, one by the Ministry of Information, and also the Imperial War Museum itself started running its official art schemes. This continued on into the Second World War with the War Artists Advisory Committee, which was a more centralised way, so we didn't have these diverse schemes going on. So the Imperial War Museum, although wasn't involved with the War Artists Advisory Committee in the Second World War, we did end up getting quite a few of the artworks. They also went to the Tate and various other regional museums. So this is sort of where the collection comes from. But we were very much associated with official government art, although that's only actually it's not even the largest part of our collection. And I should mention here that the art collection, we have 43,000 works of art. This includes 20,000 works which are sort of fine art, which you'd expect, oil and canvas, sculpture, works on paper, prints, but we also have around 20,000 posters, and we also collect things like printed ephemera and art medals. So just to give you a bit of background, it took a few decades after the Second World War for the museum to start thinking about what was going on with current conflicts, and in the 1970s we formed the Artistic Records Committee, which later went on to become the Art Commissions Committee, to continue to commission artists to cover sort of such wars as the Falklands, Bosnia. We also sent artists to Northern Ireland, and more recently to Iraq and Afghanistan. But as well as all of this, we look to collect the work by artists who are working independently, and also artists these may be famous artists or less famous artists, people who are making work at a time of huge upheaval, and maybe didn't go on to become known afterwards. Particularly my area is the Second World War, and there's quite a few artists like that at that time who went and became commercial artists or went into teaching or never heard about. But we remember them in this collection. We have some amazing examples, which we'll go into. So getting into the exhibition itself, and at this point I might show you an image just to sort of change the pace a bit of the exhibition. Let's see how this works. Okay, so not that one. So here we are. So hopefully that will be. Does that work? Does anyone see that image?
Yes, you can see that.
Yep. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so here's an image for the first room of the exhibition Architecture of War. And the reason I gave you the background to the art collection is because the Architecture of War is a selection of highlights from that collection. How do we sort of show the breadth of that collection and sort of the different aspects of it? For a long time we've been working in a way where we've had sort of chronological hangs. We've had a room about First World War art and a room about Second World War art and then a room about more contemporary art. but we've thought that really has its limitations, and so we've thought about starting a series of themed exhibitions which just take from the collection. And this exhibition, Architecture of War, opened at the end of July when the museum partially reopened. I say partially because part of it is still a building site at the moment, which ties in actually quite nicely with the themes we're looking at in the exhibition. So here, this is a shot of the first room, and this is about, as James said in his introduction, about war construction industry, because it was an interesting, when I was thinking about what is architecture of war and how do we answer that question, and when I thought about that, many themes came about. For example, I think the obvious one would be destruction of architecture, because that's an obvious sort of, when we think about architectural warfare. So there's a room about that, and there's also a room about cityscapes, because of things like the Berlin Wall. You know, when you're thinking about architecture of war, that seems to be an obvious example. But with this first room, we're thinking about places where this machinery for war is built, and thinking of that as being the architecture of war. And also, well, as you can see, there's an image there of on the left, which is that's actually Peter Makatich's photograph of a part of the Atlantic Wall but built by the Nazis, and that was in 1996. He photographed that, and this tied in very well with Deanna's work, and we'll be talking to Deanna shortly about her work. And she's in the sort of the large work sort of just off to the right of the centre of this picture, you can see. And this is called Boeing Factory Seattle, and this is actually a watercolour work, even though it's a rather large format. And we have next to that a piece by Nevinson, which I think, if I move to the next slide and let me know you can see that. Does that come up for everybody?
Yeah. Yep.
There's a little bit of delay here. We've been, as you might have been aware, we had some technical problems this morning, but yes, okay, excellent. So it was really interesting to compare works across the collection. Deanna made this in 1989. It was an IWM commission, but the print on this, a lithograph by C.R.W. Nevinson, who's a First World War artist, and he was commissioned along. Many artists were as part. One of the Ministry's information schemes was called Britain's Efforts and Ideals, and this was one of as a series that he did 6 about making aircraft. The effort scheme, and so yes, we directly tied together. He's been this just shows the process of making aircraft. Went around the early days of aircraft, but what's interesting about it is not only is the subject matter so similar, but the formats, the way it looks, the strong lines we have here are very similar, and so that was what was interesting about sort of trying to curate in this way, sort of thinking about themes and bringing together sort of works that probably wouldn't be hung together. So let me see. I don't know whether it's best to bring in Deanna now, or I can move. Actually, I'll tell you what. I'll show you one more slide. And this is another interesting comparisons between Nevinson and Deanna Petherbridge's work. So on the top left there, I think you can see my cursor, possibly that might help. Mm-hmm. That's a howitzer gun there, and that's a howitzer gun by Nevinson as a painting. Again, sort of that's quite early on in the First World War, so maybe around 1916, I think. And we have Deanna Petherbridge's Debris of War, but both these aren't actually in the exhibition, but it just goes to show, you know, this exhibition could have been done many times over. There's so many exciting examples in the art collection that could work very well. We actually bought this from Deanna in 1984. She'd made it earlier on, and so this was a sort of precursor to us thinking about commissioning her for the later work. But you can see the parallels here, and also with Graham Sutherland's breech blocks. These are sort of artillery pieces in the workshop being made. Yes, I kind of, at this time, I think I'll probably, let me get rid of me, get rid of that, and I should be back. Okay, so I wanted to bring in Deanna at this point and ask her a bit about her interest with war architecture, and sort of how long she's been. How long, Deanna, have you been using these as your subject matter?
Well, hello to everybody, and it's nice to feel that we're talking to people all over the world, or mainly in the United States, where you've got up very early. So thanks a lot for that. Well, my practice has always been drawing, in fact, since about the 1960s. But my subject matter, in a way, has related to geometries. That connection with Nevinson is not entirely fortuitous. That was the kind of early modernism that had impressed me so much as a student. And I think it had been bred into me, the notion of having a geometrical underpinning to works, which gave them a kind of strength. I expect I very much trained, and I was at art school in the 1950s, an awfully long time ago, where the work of leisure was so important too. And so the notion of a geometrical truth, not that we ever use that term, I think was absolutely bred into my practice. And even though I'm about 2,000 years old, it still maintains one of the most important factors. So through that grew an interest in architecture. My work has always been very, very architectonic. And also, I expect this interest in a subject of war, which I have been dealing with since the 1970s, when I started a series of polyptychs, that is 5-panel drawings, pen and ink drawings always. The first one was about 1973, was called The Iron Siege of Pavia, and that looked back to a kind of remote past. And showed a siege on land. The second work, The Concrete Armada, was 1978.
We can show that, actually. Shall I just see if I can get that up on the screen? Yeah. So, okay, should be coming up quite soon.
Yes, it's on the screen now.
Excellent.
And that was a work which most interestingly was hung up on the wall. I was artist in residence at Manchester City Art Gallery in 1982 during the time of the Falklands War in Britain. And that wall was actually on the that huge drawing, which was later acquired by the museum, was in the museum studio, which I was given. I was there for 6 months, just at the time of the Falklands War. So it was my entire time in Manchester was considering all the issues of war raised by the Falklands War, and it was the time too that I therefore produced drawings such as Debris of War, which we showed a little earlier.
It's really interesting to sort of, I don't know how, if everyone can see that on the main screen now, just get an idea of this, of the scale of this. I mean, it's an immense piece, and it's really, we'll be sort of looking at a detail later. But there's obviously, it's a very, as well as being a very frightening piece, it's very beautiful, and I think that comes out with just this joy of these lines and these shapes and everything that comes out in the way you make the work. And I mean, of course, what's very apparent is there's no people in the work, and I don't know whether, not in this one, I don't know whether that's a statement on sort of the dark side of humanity, is what we produce and what we do when we make these things.
Of
course, all these are so fantastic.
Really rather significant issues there, because the one is about the aestheticization of war, and that was a debate I was having with myself, and certainly having with a lot of people when I was artist in residence. We discussed it immensely. Was I, in any case, aestheticizing war? On the other hand, the fact that I was using Chiara, particularly cold, I don't work like this any longer, but a particularly cold kind of geometrical, hard-edged, measured kind of drawing, it seems to me that coldness and that hardness is what epitomized the separation that I needed for war. So it was trying to balance the two things, the kind of horror of a subject matter which was represented in a way which maybe doesn't so clearly speak about that horror. I think raised a lot of issues which, whether they worked or not, I don't know. I would also like to say that, of course, this is a narrative work. And it's in 5 panels, just as the earlier work was. And my preparation was always that there would be a third battle piece, which I never actually produced, which was going to be about planes. It was about to be battles in the air. So when I got the commission from the Imperial War Museum to go to Boeing, you can imagine how enthusiastic I was and how interested I was. So that work is a very intense work for me, not only because I was looking how they produced the planes, it was thinking about how I might have produced a third, a companion battle piece. It never happened. Life changed.
Well, it's often the way. I mean, it's interesting. I just thought I'd bring it back now to show that piece, and of course, it's very different from what you were doing before. But what's notable about it, of course, is there's no plane. You cannot see the plane. I presume those circular shapes there are where the beginning of a sort of, I want to say carcass, but it's the sort of wrong way around, isn't it? But it's the beginning of where the plane is going to be constructed. But that's enough,
yes.
you know. Yes.
I think so. And of course, this is working in that in-between world, which again is where I've always worked, between an actuality. The actuality, I think, is in the sense of this immense perspective. I mean, those aircraft factories in Boeing, the inhumanity, the scale of them, you cannot imagine how enormous they are. How the little people who were dwarfed by working there, and I remember when I was there, there was also a lot of industrial problems and so on. So there was a kind of sense of a workforce that was actually having problems in working in those factories. And I exacerbated that in a way by dealing with this huge scale. So I was working with the reality of the setting. You can see the lights in those enormous perspectives going up. You can see the perspective underneath, an inhuman scale perspective. But I was also dealing with the body of the plane almost as a logo, as it's not very realistic. It's hanging in midair, it's catching your eye, which I think is also why the drawing catches your eye as you go into the actual exhibition where it's on at the moment in the Imperial War Museum. So again, I'm working in the interstices between two kinds of worlds, much more abstract in that sense than the Nevinson on the right.
Yes, absolutely, and of course this was more of his representational works, because I think part of a commission, and but I think what really dominates here is the sort of the structures of the belts above, and of course the people. That's a major difference again, and there are the people there, but they're rather everyman. They could, you know, they're not sort of individuals. They're just sort of wheels in the machine, really. And I think that's a theme that comes out quite a lot with this particular. Hang on, it's moved. Yes. With this particular section of the exhibition, is I kept finding works that kind of showed this awe of this construction of the machine and of sort of people being dwarfed. This one by Charles Murray here, and there is actually a rather shadowy figure here under the pools of light, but the plane really dominates in this strange, awesome sort of space. And of course, I suppose there's a lot of excitement about technology and what it can do. This is actually is a monoprint by Charles Murray, and he gave this to the War Artists Advisory Committee. He was not an official war artist, but they did accept this work. On the right, we do have an image by Raymond Mcgrath. This is training aircraft under construction from about 1941, and he was actually commissioned on the same subject to go and show aircraft.
I think we're losing you.
Hugely important to this side of.
Sorry, Claire, we just lost you for a moment. Can you speak again? See if we can hear you.
I actually have one question for Deanna, actually, if there's an opportunity before Claire comes back. But Deanna, when you went to the Boeing assembly plant, were you? This sounds probably like a silly question, but was that plane being built specifically for war, or was that just another plane that was being built? Because what I'm trying to get at is, with artists like Nevinson, for example, and making the engine in 1917, what he was sort of witnessing was a huge war effort, whereas actually the Boeing plant in 1989 is probably making all sorts of planes for all sorts of purposes. But were you very aware that that was a military plane or a war plane?
I have to say, on that trip, I had there were two parts of my trip. I also actually visited a helicopter factory where I saw people making war helicopters. In the Boeing factory, I was not allowed to ask the question.
Okay.
It was just not, I think there were probably areas that I wasn't allowed to see, and anything to do with military training was absolutely off limits, and there were certain questions I wasn't allowed to ask. So I didn't know. Very possibly what I saw was the non-military part of the factory. And I had to interpolate the imaginative specifics, should we say, that was a warplane.
And I have to say, from a viewer's perspective, I'm not sure it matters. I don't think it matters because the communication is absolutely clear. And I think, you can kind of, if there are any gaps, one can fill them in themselves. Do you know what I mean, right? It's just an interesting comparison between the way war artists, let's say in the First or Second World War, would perhaps document what was going on, and something more contemporary. It's just quite interesting.
Yes,
it is an interesting one. Oh no.
I was going to jump in too, and it's interesting, Deanna. You're talking about that sense of having to join up the gaps, and it's something that work does so well. In that that void almost, which you describe as being a bit like a logo, but it also seems to take on something of the properties of an occult symbol or of some kind of very mysterious and almost Kabbalistic fantasy. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for making that. At the moment I have, this year, I've curated an exhibition, in fact, about witches, and I've become very interested in the occult. It's just closed in Edinburgh. It was part of the Edinburgh Festival. So thank you for that commentary. It didn't occur to me, but I certainly saw it as something very central which would focus that enormous perspective. And bring you backwards and forwards. So it acted as a formal device as well, but I'm glad it has mystical qualities.
And the other work, the Politic, what was the source material for that? I mean, is there any sense of you're working in situ, or are you working from photographs, or is this again a kind of fantasy war landscape?
The Concrete Armada.
Yes.
Yes, no, that was definitely absolutely based on and looking very carefully, visiting the sites, looking at photographs, and looking at Hitler's Atlantic Wall, thinking about a ringed in Europe. After all, he tried to build a wall all the way around Europe, a most extraordinary, mad kind of notion. And what is really interesting is that one of the panels, of course, also has those very curious things sitting up in the sea, which were the kinds of models now for oil rig platforms. And at that time, I remember when I was doing the drawing in England, there was something called Radio Caroline, which was, I think you can see it on that second panel there. Radio Caroline was actually participating in one of these out in the sea, in one of these offshore creatures standing up. I can't remember what they were called, up on those enormous long platforms. A platform, I expect. It had another word. And what is so extraordinary is years later. Yes. Years later, when my mother died, a whole lot of material came to me, and I recovered something I'd done as a child. I was only 6 or 7. And I discovered a little notebook of a little collage book where I'd stuck in things as a child. And my goodness, if those forts, those sea forts weren't actually there. They'd been buried in my unconscious. I think very curious for a girl child too, if one can be gendered about this thing. Obviously, the potency of these great war things which were set in the sea, which somehow were in the sea and were somehow going to protect England. I don't quite know how they were going to work. It was so potent for me. It had remained and just grew out again so many years later, 20, 30 years later.
Dare I say it, they have a kind of monstrousness to them as well, don't they? I was talking about figures disappearing, but of course here we have these little figurines, which must also be vast, huge-scale machines, taking on an anthropomorphic quality. One of the most exciting works for me in the exhibition, Claire, is the Leonard Rosserman rangefinder in hot sunlight, which looks for all the world like some kind of garlic, come insect, come transformer, with a pool of blood underneath it.
Yes, he was very excited. Unfortunately, I haven't got an image for that one, which I should have brought along. But yes, I think that's very. He was particularly interested in seeing these anthropomorphic figures within these strange devices that he was in the Pacific on one of those massive ships, and I think for a long time was actually quite bored. He kind of kept missing the action, and didn't know what sort of subject matter to start with. And then when he was on, for weeks and weeks on board on the sort of hot sunlight of the Pacific area, beating down, that was a rangefinder that he was painting. He was also painting these amazing we've got other ones he's done of aircraft waiting to go on the aircraft carrier, and they've got their wings folded up like moths, so he's made them look like strange like little animals and stuff. But that carries on with other artists we have in the collection as well, more contemporary artists. We've just purchased some work by the sculptor Alison Wilding. Unfortunately not in this show. It's up in we've got an exhibition of contemporary art from the collection up in our Manchester branch called it's called Catalyst, and she's did these lovely watercolours but they're of drones, and these drones that look like birds. And I think this certainly is a sort of theme that's coming out for some artists, is this strange fascination with the machinery that sort of takes on, it says actually more than what we can with some of our more obvious studies of people and what they're doing. It's what can we see from the machines that we build, and I think this is an interesting theme to explore.
It takes on a weird, almost romantic life, doesn't it? In Revelius or something. I mean, again, that wonderful juxtaposition you've got of the Sutherland breech blocks, which look like eyes, and the Rosserman, it's like a set of portraits of machinery. Is that something you're considering? I've lost Claire.
Yes, can I just come in at this point and say, one of the great things about this exhibition, The Architectural War, and obviously that was a title very much after my heart, was to see how subtly and cleverly Claire has juxtaposed works. I think it's absolutely a spot-on exhibition in terms of the sensitivity of the juxtapositions of works on the show.
Which is no mean feat, because you had how many? 20,000.
Thank you very much. That was what was most exciting for me about. Yes. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. There's about 20,000 works that I could have chosen from, and there's I think it's about 55 works in the exhibition. So yeah, very very difficult, but very exciting at the same time to sort of draw the sort of distinctions across very different sorts of works. And I brought these ones up because, of course, Leslie Cole should be familiar with this. We've been using that as the banner on to promote the event today. And they're reading a blueprint for the manufacture of a naval gun, and I thought that was important to show sort of the how, again, we have got people here working together, and this one is I mean, it's rather beautiful work. It's very stylized, but there's sort of a nicer aspect. But you have to bear in mind that he was desperate to be a war artist during the Second World War, so he brought this and a few other works that he'd made independently to the War Artists Advisory Committee, hoping that they would buy them. And in fact they did, and they did grant him a salary position, and he travelled all over the world and as an official war artist after that. And I mean, he saw awful sights, atrocities. He went to Belsen when it was liberated. He was in the Far East as well, and saw the terrible sights there. But this is an early work. It kind of shows a sort of an optimism before this happens, and it gave artists a focus, really. But on the flip side, I wanted to show the Margaret Abbess work, because this is very different, because she once you know the background, because she was actually an art student, and her during the Second World War, and she had to stop her studies to go and work in a Spitfire factory making parts. So this was done in about 1941, I think, 1942, and she did this. She did this on the quiet. She had nothing to do with the official war art scheme. She was just quietly making sketches, many of them from memory when she got home, because without a permit to sketch, she'd be in serious trouble, and be accused of spying or all sorts. And but again, you see, obviously the people here in rows and are completely anonymous, but there's an intimacy to this work that hasn't quite got this the frightening aspect of Deanna's or even Nevinson's work. But we're very grateful for the family for coming to us. It was only about 5 years ago they approached the museum and said, "Oh, my mother made this work. She was still alive at the time, and she wants to throw it away. She's not interested, you know." And she doesn't think it's worth much, and we were so glad to get this. It's quite a substantial amount of drawings by her, and to show this sort of independent aspect, this sort of other side of the story. So then that was interesting to juxtapose that with Nevinson and Deanna's work, and as well as Bomberg as well, which I can't show today, but hopefully you remember from the exhibition, or if you haven't been to the exhibition, please come. It's still on for a while. It's on until May 2014, and it's a free exhibition at Lambeth Road in London, so very welcome to come. Yes,
Claire,
so it's just, yes, please, yes.
Looking at the Mary Abbess, that, I mean, one painting that, of course, by dint of the fact that you've got a huge collection, but one that wasn't there is, of course, Laura Knight's, and the image, the Ruby Loftus screwing a breech ring, and that image of concentrated heroism. And I wonder whether you could tell us a bit about some of the choices you had to make in terms of what you left out, but also whether you're deliberately turning away from certain types of heroic imagery of the architecture of war.
Yeah, I think with that particular image, it's a very famous image. So there's also an element of trying to find images that we're less well known for. And also the National Portrait Gallery they were borrowing it for a Laura Knight exhibition, an excellent Laura Knight exhibition that was happening this year. So, but yes, it was a heroic image, and she's an unusual war artist actually, because she was such a famous artist and she was a real star, and she wasn't one of the artists that was kind of made their name. She'd already made her name that way, and in fact it's fascinating if you read some of the minutes as of wrangling over pay, because war artists weren't paid very much, and she was Laura Knight, and you know, she should have she wanted the right pay, fair enough. But Ruby, I mean, the whole thing about that, the story of that painting, Ruby Loftus was a remarkable woman who she could learn to do this. It was an incredibly difficult task, which took years and years for men, you know, to master. And then, of course, the combination with Laura Knight, who was this sort of extraordinary figure. So I think that, yes, like you say, heroism. It's a piece which sort of, it doesn't tell the sort of everyday, I suppose. And I think what I was trying to do with the architecture show is show different stories, but also like we've been talking about, the juxtapositions were important, and so I was kind of thinking about it in a very visual way, and finding images that really sort of did more when they were hung next to each other than they would by themselves. So that was really important, how it all hung together. It was sort of this joint effort. So, and in fact, I mean, there's other ones, certainly with Paul Nash as well. People have said to me, well, there's no Paul Nash show, and well, there's going to be a lot of Paul Nash next year as part of the exhibition about First World War art. So that's all I can say to that one. But yeah, just trying to find sort of surprises, really. Hopefully, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, there's Laura Knight behind my head, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, you can see a bit of a Laura Knight. Yeah.
Yes.
The good old name. Yeah.
No, I thought there are some really fantastic surprises. I mean, as Deanna said, this extraordinary juxtaposition, sometimes stylistic, sometimes geographical, sometimes historical. And the other thing that really struck me was something about scale, I suppose, the intimacy of a lot of these works in spite of the kind of horrific vastness of what they're trying to cope with. Is it, I mean, partly that must have been dictated by space, that you've chosen a lot of works on paper, but Deanna,
Yes.
you're a watercolor artist, or that work is certainly in watercolor. You feel that what is it about the work on paper that was so important in this exhibition?
Well, actually, works on paper make up a huge amount of our collection. I think I can't think of exact figures, but I think it's around 12 to 13,000 out of the 20,000. And the reason for that is it suits war artists. It's much easier to take paper with you when you're traveling, and a lot of the paintings have to be made afterwards that are based on the work on paper. So, in fact, during the Second World War in particular, a lot of the artists were illustrator artists, and they were chosen for that reason, and that was their particular their medium. So, yeah, maybe it's also a personal bias as well, but yeah, it does sort of reflect the collection, you know, and I think that was important to show that we do have some very impressive paintings and that are on a large scale. But yes, you can, of course, practically you can show less if you're going to show one large painting. But also sometimes I find there's a power in these intimate works. I'm thinking particularly of some of the works in the final room. We've got Philip Minsky, who's a Far East prisoner of war artist. His amazing drawing of flooded huts. But yes, I think actually yes, we're getting questions in at this moment because I've got a feeling we're probably getting a bit pressed for time as well. So. We've got a question from the audience. This is from our friends on Twitter, maybe, I'm not sure. So this is a question for me or Deanna. I think the beauty of her work, so Deanna's work, is in the previous drawings is a reflection of such a painful event in the purity of geometry, shadows, and lights. Was there an intention to transmit this feeling, or was it created as a personal experience? Does that make sense to you, Deanna? I think it's a question for you, really. Just I think the question really is, this person wants to know: is this a work very personal for you? Really, I think that's the gist of the question.
I think when one deals with subjects like war, you are moving into a very, very large format. Obviously, if you're dealing with war, this is not about the personal experience, for example, like that little Margaret Abbess drawing, which goes back to the previous question, which is eyewitness, somebody sitting with a sketchbook, doing a very intimate attempt to catch a moment in time. No, I think my works, and of course the point is that I'm an artist who's tried to make paper and drawing fit for another purpose, not just as preparations for works in another medium, but saying that you can have monumental works in paper and ink. So first of all, that's in a way been my lifetime remit to make monumental works. These are monumental, and I think they are addressed to general considerations about war. They are not personal works in the sense also because of the deliberate distancing of the perspectives, the multiple perspectives, the distancing of these rather cold geometrical techniques. All of those notions are to put up an image about war and invite a debate, I think, on a monumental scale. These works are very much meant to be for others. They are not personal works in that sense.
Well, I think that's very interesting because as women artists, often are kind of associated with personal works, and it's kind of, oh, you know, that's sort of a bit of a cliche, and the fact that you're not doing that is really interesting. And but ever since we did an exhibition a few years ago about women war artists, and I think it's been important for us to kind of show that side, because there are quite a few cliches that do float about that, you know, women make personal work, and this is quite obviously not, isn't it? And I think monumental was the word, and it's an important word to bring in about your work, and some of the works that came in, particularly Peter McIntyre's photograph of the Atlantic Wall. He shows that so well. He shows it like sculpture. He shows it how powerful that architecture is in sort of imposing this tyranny. So yes, I think that's a good point. Has anyone got any more questions, actually?
I've just got one thing that was interesting with relation to the previous question about the kind of intimacy of drawing, and one of my favourite works actually is the little sketchbook that Paul Ryan made from Hiroshima, And it was something that I caught as I was leaving the exhibition. Actually, I could have easily overlooked it because it's quite small. But actually, I think it's a really beautiful thing to explore, because not only is it a kind of little sketch, he's also annotated it as well. And actually, one of my favourite parts was one of the little annotations in the lower left. He was clearly, he clearly dated it and timed it. So he said it's 7:55 p.m. and he's getting tired, and he stops for tofu and leek at Chikara, and it's delicious. And I just really love the idea that, like, we talk about Deanna being sort of, removed from some of her subject matter, or some artists you take a kind of slightly, distanced approach to it. Actually, that's a work which kind of really reveals the fact that he was actually there, and, it's a very, very human exercise, and he's kind of making it very clear that that's the case. And I think sketches can be very intimate, but also works on paper, as Deanna says, can be monumental, but they can also be very personal. So I think that's quite an interesting sort of an idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you picked up on that one. That was he was another IWM commission, actually, and he went over to the Far East to sort of investigate memorials. But his particular sort of interest, and he's written academic papers on this, is the sketchbook and sort of and the power of the sketchbook, and how the problem of how you show a sketchbook, and sort of, so the paradox of this piece is it's not actually the original sketchbook. He's copied the pages, just the ones that are open, so you're not losing anything. All those ones that you can't see are just blank anyway. And he's presented this in this little frame, and he's shown sort of that. Yeah, I suppose it shows us a moment in time from that particular day when he was struck by seeing the memorial there, and his thoughts. But yes, he's reproducing it as well. So it's kind of a curious object, actually. And yes, and a very one. It's a good point, because it's completely opposite to the way that Deanna works, and it's on a completely different scale. And yes, and that's what's again exciting about this exhibition, to be able to show the sort of diversity of the works that we have.
But for anyone who's viewing this who hasn't yet seen the show, I would just say, really take time to look at everything, because there are little gems that you might, not just the big monumental pieces, but have a really good look at some of the little things, because there's some really beautiful things in there.
Thank you. Yes, excellent. Okay, I don't know whether, because I know I'm aware of the time. It's 2 o'clock. I don't know whether because I know we started a bit late. But is there anybody else? Because I know there's some people coming in on social media who might be sending in some questions. Is there any more, James, about coming through?
We have nothing else from our audience at the moment.
Okay, fair enough.
Did any of you panelists have any other final topics to go over before we wrap up?
Well, in fact, I'd just like to say you brought up with the Paul Ryan. The question of a sketchbook is something also which reveals a narrative. It's very small. He does everything now and then, and in fact, he did write a PhD about this. It's about narrative. And I think that's one way of dealing with narrative. Again, the personal narrative is against the kind of narrative which you can have in those 5-panel works. Drawing is always about connections. It's a series of lines which connect one thing with the other. So one reads drawings much more closely as one would read text in a way. It's linear. It's about narrative aspects much more, for example, than paint. So I think this, the notion of a war also being a kind of narrative. Narratives of battles are what we've all always known about. And I think today, with soldiers serving in Afghanistan, we have film moving in and giving narratives of people actually in action. I think the notion of narrative and war is becoming something closer and closer together.
That's an interesting point. I suppose the one thing I'd want to leave on is, I haven't got an image here, but so there's very interesting work by Langlands and Bell, who were commissioned by the IWM to go to Afghanistan, and they certainly saw a narrative there. The work we have in this show, in the Architecture of War show, shows a photograph of the ruined palace of Kabul with a checkerboard pattern overlaid the top, which is a filter you see the ruined palace through, and it's got acronyms relating to international airports, and they're very much that, you know, as good as I think a lot of the artists now have problems when they go out. It's sort of the successor to what used to go on with the Second World War. We do send artists out, but we give them a very free rein when they go to these places. But what happened in Afghanistan is a lot of them, they just couldn't really. What could they show? They were there. It was the aftermath, and so their photograph by itself didn't really say very much. So by overlaying this checkerboard pattern relating to the international airport shows the sort of the connections with the international community and the interest in what was happening there. And they've also, I think their other very famous work, they were nominated for the Turner Prize. Their very famous work was the house of Osama bin Laden, because they actually managed to photograph the house that he lived in Afghanistan when it was deserted, and they made it into they got together a software company and made it into a video game, and you can go around with the joystick. Again, that's up at our contemporary art show up at Manchester as well. And they were interested in the architecture. How do you relate this very basic house in Afghanistan with the Twin Towers? How this is how this man has linked these two very different types of architecture. So yeah, they're trying to find a sort of complex narrative with these works and trying to explore that with these works and ask questions. Really, I mean. Sorry, did someone?
Sorry, I was going to say that work has a real knowingness to it in a way that some perhaps of the documentary sketches might not. A sense of being involved. You mentioned the checkerboard pattern, but you're a player in that game as an artist, and having to really sort of disguise the fact that you're not really just presenting something that is a documentary photograph. And I suppose some of the more contemporary works in the exhibition often seem more conscious of the sort of moral or ethical doubts of being a witness to these things, or a witness of the aftermath to them.
Yeah, I think that's a general sort of, you can say that about a lot of contemporary artists anyway, that they're just generally more conscious about what points they're trying to make anyway, and it doesn't do any more really to just go out and draw what you see. And there was an element when the museum was founded and the collection was started about recording, but now when we look back at the images of the First World War, it's paintings by Nevinson, paintings by Bomberg, by these sort of avant-garde artists, which are the most interesting ones, and the ones that sort of faithfully tried to record what they saw in a very sort of what you might think realistic manner, where they're not the interesting ones. So yeah, the artists that sort of try and find that you mix your own approach to what you're observing and try and bring something new to that. And that's important. It's important to seek. That's what artists do, really, is to show another side and make us think. And that's a big part of what our art collection is here for. Is really it doesn't always provide straight answers, and hopefully makes you think about all sorts of issues when you come to the art galleries. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, and the rest of the panelists. I think we're now over time. I'm sorry to you, the audience, that we ran late, but personally I found that a very invigorating discussion about such a dark topic. It's amazing to kind of get a greater insight into the creative response to this sort of material, particularly directly from you, Deanna. It's marvelous to have had you speaking with us today. Thank also to you, Claire. The exhibition is open until next May, you say, so I think there's plenty of opportunity for people to go and take a look. And thanks as well, Chris, for your insight, and to you, Thomas, from Apollo Magazine. Thanks to everyone here on the Art Project and the Google Cultural Institute. We have another art talk coming soon, so watch this space, and thanks again for your time today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
happens now.